Week one of the Paris COP is over. Highlights would have to be on the first day, on the Monday, the world leaders giving their speeches, some great speeches as you'd expect, really kind of upbeat words from all the leaders in terms of the importance of climate change, how they need to come together to tackle it. Barack Obama's speech was really powerful, and he stayed on through much of last week negotiating other things as well, so discussing other issues as well as climate change. So it really got that impetus from the start, which was a masterstroke from the French presidency to have the world leaders there at the beginning to set things up and then leave the negotiators to do the hard work for the rest of the week. So in terms of real highlights in terms of the negotiations, one would be on an issue called loss and damage. And this is an issue that's been running for a long time, particularly from the developing nations who say, yes, we can adapt to some climate change. Yes, we can take some finance, some help from your countries to build sea defences and protect agriculture. But for some of us, small island states, for instance, we can't adapt. Basically, we're going to have loss and damage from climate change, whatever we do. And so they wanted essentially that made clear in the negotiating text to say that the developed world nations recognise loss and damage, things which we can't adapt to from climate change, and for that to be developed into a mechanism to help in terms of whether it's migration from it could be a whole nation, an island nation, having to migrate to another area. So places like Tuvalu having to migrate to New Zealand, for instance. So that's there in the draft text, and negotiations there were tricky because there was this worry from the developed nations that there would be issues of liability and actually them being sued essentially by people who are suffering loss and damage from climate change and saying you rich countries are to blame, you need to pay. And so that was a careful bit of negotiation to say we need this, we need to make it clear in the text that this is happening and that not all climate change can be adapted to, but make sure that that doesn't open up this kind of suing of nations for their past emissions. The UK would be particularly vulnerable to that given our past emissions. So they've got something in the text which seems to bridge those differences, so that's great. Another highlight, I guess, it looks good at the moment. There's another long-running issue, and it's about transparency. So one of the things we need when we're cutting emissions to tackle climate change is clear numbers. We need to know how the nations are doing, what their current emissions are, and how they're reducing them. And that's been an area of contention because, again, a lot of nations aren't as well set up as the UK, for instance, to measure their emissions and report them. And certainly the developing world nations would say that they need less strict rules in terms of reporting and verification of reductions. And the developed world nations say, well, if we're going to give you financing to cut your emissions, we need good numbers and we need essentially objective measurement of those. And those negotiations seem to have, again, the US has been key in this in terms of those negotiations finding some middle ground and saying, the way the climate negotiations have been set up dates back to 1992. And so what we called a developing nation then, and its ability to measure its emissions and be transparent, has changed. Some nations are much better in terms of their ability to measure emissions and their growth in terms of money and economy, so China being a perfect example. And so there seems to be more of an acceptance that there's some middle ground in terms of transparency, and that was really important for the developed world countries to get. Yeah, so going into week two, I think I'm less optimistic about us getting the deal that the world needs than I was at the beginning of the COP. The two things which stand out that are still very problematic, I think, are the differentiation issue. So this idea that the developed world nations should bear the brunt of the burden in cutting emissions. And that differentiation, again, dates back to 1992 in the current form. And that is a real issue when we come down to big nations like China, because 1992 was a long time ago for them in terms of how their economy's grown since. So that's a real area, particularly in terms of finance, and the idea that all the finance should flow from what were classed as the developed world nations in 1992, and the developing nations back then, don't take as much responsibility. And I think that needs to move, and that's looking difficult. The other really disappointing thing at the moment, so it's a draft text. The draft text went to ministers this morning, so it was published on Saturday. And one of the key things in there was a thing which is called the ratchet mechanism. And the ratchet mechanism in the draft text earlier on was all about, we've got, commitments or contributions from each nation leading up to Paris, and the science tells us they're not enough to avoid dangerous climate change, to meet the 2 degree or below limit. But what the ratchet mechanism was designed to do was to say, okay, we've got these stepping stones towards where we need to be, and the ratchet mechanism would allow us to review how everyone's getting on, and in 2020 people would resubmit and submit much more ambitious emission cuts based on the science. So that was really important, so we could go away from Paris and saying, okay, it's not got us all the way, but we've got a mechanism in place now to keep coming back and actually get more and more aggressive in terms of cutting emissions. And what that ratchet mechanism at the moment looks like being is much weaker. So instead of in 2020 all the nations submitting more ambitious targets, actually at the moment it's looking like, okay, we'll revisit them and we'll have a look at how we're doing, but actually the new targets would be post 2030 for most nations. So what they've committed now in terms of their individual contributions would kind of set them from 2020 to 2030. So we wouldn't be able to get that kind of that ratcheting in terms of extra emissions cuts quickly, which is really what we need to meet the 2 degrees. So it's still a draft text, and so that could still change. But at the moment, the wording's gone more towards the softer touch for that mechanism, and that's disappointing.